For nearly a century, we have known the origins of the uniqueness of Western civilization. On the steppes of Ukraine, now southern Russia, our ancestors developed a tradition which would set the foundation for thousands of years to come. They led a verbal, contractual, historical tradition focused on listening to testimony, storytelling, and possessing myths. However, this tradition lacked authoritarian symbolism, idols, or mysticism. They were typical of the Indo-European people. With the unification of the horse, wheel, and bronze, they turned to raiding. These pig, sheep, and goat herders dropped the peaceful and cooperative mythology and adopted the aggressive warrior mythology, which would lay the foundation for verbal, contractual tradition, thus dividing the Indo-European peoples. The heroic age was born. The other tribes responded by creating religion from mythology as a resistance movement, and later used religion as a foundation for law. The conquerors spread in all directions, forced by tribal competition to adopt the new technologies, just as all other military technologies have since been adopted out of necessity. Each of the three major branches used the new technology to rule their own people, and if possible or necessary, to gain good territory, to conquer and rule other peoples, and then extract taxation to pay for the high cost of bronze, horse, and wheel. These were Northern and Western Aryans, Europeans, Southern Aryans, Iranians, and Eastern Aryans, Indians. We don't know what happened to the people in the Far East other than that they appear to be gone. This ruling caste succeeded in conquering everything within the European and Asian plains, from Asia to Spain and as far south as Egypt. With time, the population was changing. They used manorialism and serfdom to cause upward redistribution of reproduction, from the underclasses to the middle and upper classes, if we can stretch the meaning of middle class back that far. And they used war, winters, taxation, and aggressive punishment to cull troublemakers, even enforcing late marriage. The consequence was a reduction in the ratio of the unproductive underclasses to the productive upper classes. We call this domestication when we refer to plants and animals, but we call it oppression when we do it to humans. However, these people applied domestication to man with the same passion that they did to their herds, and it worked. In those places where they were most successful because of less territorial competition, in Europe, they maintained the tradition of contractualism between the peerage, aristocracy, and maintained egalitarian meritocracy. Those who fight earned rights, and the prohibition on the concentration of power in any of them, all of which developed from the warrior tradition. The Greeks, Hittites, Romans, and Celts all practiced the same contractualism, sovereignty, heroic ethic, and aristocratic egalitarianism by merit. Conversely, the Fertile Crescent did not, since their chief problem was not creating contracts between violent raiders, but rather to organize large populations in concert with the flood cycle, for which they used propaganda. And by the time the Axial Age hit China, the aristocracy and peasantry were already formed, and ritual developed there as a means of controlling aristocracy's tendency to exhaust production for their feasts. So the Chinese maintained authority, and the Crescent maintained authority, while the European branch of the Aryans maintained contractualism, meritocratic egalitarianism, and personal heroic sovereignty. Martial men, as members of an initiatic brotherhood of warriors, whether normative, legal, or ritualistic, must negotiate. And when martial men negotiate, they rely upon martial epistemology, empiricism, and hold to the sacredness of truth, testimony, and contract. If for no other reason than in battle one can bear very high costs of error, optimism, betrayal, and dishonesty. These men negotiate and argue their positions, and the headman, general, chieftain, or king, judges and chooses from the different arguments presented. It is this testimonial, argumentative debate from which reason, and eventually Aristotelian science, takes its origins. The Romans adopted Greek thinking, but not Greek rhetoric, since they thought it full of what we would consider today weasel words. They favored plain speech. They adopted Stoic natural law as their inspiration, not Greek politicized speech, moving man still closer to empiricism. There are only three ways of coercing man, and we evolved all three of them: religious inclusion or exclusion, legal punishment and liberty, credit consumption or deprivation. We can control people through religion, law, and credit. Religion is a loose method of control, law a precise but limited, and credit an individualistic method of control. But each also has different costs. Religion is cheap. Law requires a tax structure to finance it, and credit requires elaborate institutions and high trust between credit issuers. Education also bears different costs. Literacy is expensive, numbers more so, law more so, and philosophy even more. The Aegean Mediterranean civilization was costly. So with the combination of resisting the Germanic migrations, the exhaustion of the slave economy, the Justinian plague, the loss of the North African grains to the Muslims, and centuries of raiding against the Mediterranean, they could not compete any more than the prior Dark Age could compete against the Sea Peoples. So the church was able to govern, but only by imposing Christianity by force, closing the Stoic and Greek schools, and allowing the empire to devolve into thousands of regional manors, each defending what it could with its own resources. Religion is cheap if imprecise government. The church ruled with literacy, diplomacy, and superstition, where Rome had ruled with religious liberty, law, and credit. The Europeans tried to resurrect Roman law once they rediscovered it. The Templars came along and developed the first system of international credit. But the Pope, knowing his brother was deeply in debt to the Templars, framed them in the hope of rescuing his brother from the debt and possibly claiming the Templar holdings for the church. However, the Pope didn't understand banking. Money is always at work or it is useless. And he destroyed the Templars and banking. The Jews, who unlike the Templars were weak, then filled the void in the market for credit. But as we know now, there was no gold not working in Templar hands. About the same time, two things occur. The British lawyer, Bacon, arrived with his invention of empiricism, a novel invention over Aristotelian near science, and the formation of the Hanseatic civilization. Though referred to by many names, Germanic, Protestant, Northern European, the Hanseatic civilization was caused by the adoption by the Frisians of bipartite manorialism, which was the most eugenic economic system in the history of man. This spread throughout Northern Europe starting in about 700, and by 1200 had changed the genetics, culture, and economy of what we think of as Northern Europe. The Hansa bridged the Mediterranean trade overland and by sea, and the North Sea then replaced the Aegean Mediterranean economy as the dominant economic force in Europe until the colonies were discovered. Like the alliance between Sparta, Athens, and Rome, the Atlantic became the Mediterranean of the ancient world, bridging Germany, Britain, and America. The balance of power shifted from the Hansa to the west, while the Hansa continued to spread German genes, culture, and economy to the east. As they spread, they carried with them the ancient Aryan tradition of contractualism, which is described by tales of George Washington's honesty here in America, a character more underrated in history than nearly any man but Bacon. When Jefferson put pen to paper, he did not know that he almost succeeded in developing strictly constructed law from the first principle of the natural law of contractualism. Had he, we would have seen the birth of scientific government. Natural, judge-discovered, strictly constructed, operationally testable common law. Had he done so, the Enlightenment might have been completed. Not having done so, we had to endure the French, Russian, German, and cosmopolitan Enlightenments, and like waves of disasters, each caused catastrophic damage to the West. English empiricism was correct, but the theory of man as an oppressed potential aristocracy of everyone was false. French moralism was incorrect and merely an excuse to replace one set of rulers with another, creating the terrors and ending France's contribution to Western civilization. The German reaction to Napoleon destroyed the heart of Europe by unifying princedoms that preserved our martial and oath traditions. The cosmopolitan Enlightenment was terrified by the Darwinian and capitalist revolutions and created the pseudosciences of Boasian anthropology, Marxist economics and sociology, Freudian psychology, and Frankfurtian cultural critique, even Kantorian mathematical Platonism. The Russians took the French and the German and the cosmopolitan, Jews, and created the horrors of Bolshevism, Trotskyism, and the Soviets, and ended the Russian Enlightenment, which had previously been literary and orthodox, and made it pseudoscientific. This cosmopolitan movement, threatened in Europe, moved to New York and was funded by Columbia University. This resulted in the adoption of pseudosciences by the Academy, now willing to sell them to underclasses finally having access to education. Unaware, these students were being taught the same deceitful resistance movement to aristocracy and truth that their ancestors had been taught as religion, now using pseudoscience, pseudo-rationalism, fabricated history, and cultural criticism to replace the previous myths of religion. At the beginning of the last century, a group of thinkers understood that the world was being converted to a pseudo-scientific religion of rebellion against the truth, and that this was replacing the prior era's conversion to mysticism as a rebellion against the truth. These men unfortunately did not come to any consensus on how to solve the problem of the new mysticism masquerading as pseudo-rationalism, pseudoscience, and mathematical Platonism. Poincaré raised the battle flag, then Mises in economics, Hayek in law, and Popper in philosophy. What made us, the West, so different from the rest? What made the West originated on the steppe, north and east of the Black Sea, where sometime after the Great Deluge, a group of people developed a purely empirical mind, absent the dreams and fantasies of the later ages. Throughout our history, a young man took an oath upon his maturity. I shall not lie or steal or strike me dead. This phrase in 1,000 promises, 1,000 oaths, echoes throughout our history in every era. And this testimony, this oath, is the secret of the West. The combination of oath, sacrifice in battle, truthful empirical testimony, jury of peers, an independent judiciary, and the sacredness of that oath. With this combination as the basis for natural, judge-discovered common law, a people small in number against much greater numbers and much greater wealth will innovate and adapt to change faster than all other civilizations known to man. We are not always first, but where we are not first, we are fastest, because of the oath. This is why we are the origin of more art and science than all civilization and history combined, despite our youth and small numbers. Churches matter in every civilization, in any group of people. Rituals are required, ceremonies, feasts, and celebrations. We must find some way to recreate the safety of the small tribe, to keep us one somehow, to invoke the pack response we call spiritualism, submission to the pack, to create bonds with those whom outside of church we may even compete with. But it matters little what occurs in those churches other than that we come together to submit to one another, develop and preserve kinship love for one another, despite our lack of kinship. Our church did some valuable things. She attempted to maintain some semblance of order as the empire collapsed, attempted to preserve knowledge while ignorance expanded, forbid cousin marriage in an effort to break up the lands of the great families so that they could be purchased more cheaply by the church. She managed what little resistance to the expansion of Islam and created an educated and literate cult of administration over the territories, despite teaching nonsense to people, failing to educate them, and leaving them in darkness for nearly 1,000 years. But given that the church mythology was constructed from a combination of those same ancient myths, not the least of which was Mithraism of the soldiery, there is very little within the church's teachings that did not exist prior to it. And there is much, if not more, bad done by the church as good. The Pope's current campaign in favor of the Third World at the expense of the First is just the most recent example of preserving the institution instead of reforming it. We no longer need governance by religion, only ritual, festival, ceremony, and perhaps education. We do need governance by law, and the whole world is rebelling despite its incomprehension of cause against governance by credit, which favors a few at the expense of the many, no longer serves the family, tribe, and nation, and is no longer eugenic, but dysgenic on a scale we have never seen before in human history, a price future generations will pay as much as the Dark Ages did. As the marginal differences in knowledge and production are eradicated by global trade and communication, the favelas and slums will be unable to change, because there is no method of using voluntary incentives to organize production of large numbers of underclasses with the same productive capacity of any upper and middle class. The Third World will no longer starve, but it will remain poor. There are many kinds of dark ages, and we are just as likely to enter one as exit the current stagnation. There is plenty in our history to worship, to celebrate, to feast over, to ritualize, and to ceremonialize. We can love Jesus truthfully as a philosopher, or untruthfully as a prophet. We can love our Western God as a wise father rather than feign submission to the Jewish imitation of an Egyptian one. We can pray for wisdom to not only our gods and saints, but our scientists, philosophers, artists, craftsmen, warriors, and wise men. We can celebrate life rather than fear death. We can celebrate nature rather than heaven. We can revel in our defeats of the great darknesses of time, ignorance, poverty, disease, and suffering. We can learn our great history of truth-telling and honor, the skills of parenting, the skills of life, the skills of civic duty, and our skills of war. Because that would be telling the truth to one another. And that's what it means to be Western.